Well, we are back today in Caesarea Maritime. In Paul the Apostle's day, this was a spectacular place. It was like Rome right here on the Mediterranean coast of Israel. There were palaces and racetracks and theaters like the one we find ourselves in right now. And there was a jail where Paul found himself for 2 years and several chapters of the book of Acts. Paul is at the temple in Jerusalem with some other disciples for 7 days of a purification ritual. Acts 21:27. Then the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid! This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he's even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." And then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. And so just imagine this. You've got this man, Paul, who, from the perspective of his adversaries, has been quite a troublemaker. They've heard about these riots that have broken out in all kinds of cities that he's preached in Asia Minor and in Europe. You remember the 25,000 tradesmen from the Trades Guild who rioted against him in Ephesus. And you've got this guy, Paul, this apparent troublemaker, now washing ashore in Israel and heading up to Jerusalem. Well, it sounds like all bedlam is about to break loose, and it does. Watch what happens next. Acts 21:31. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some of the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander couldn't get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers, and the crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" And Paul basically says to the Roman centurion, "Hey, is it legal to torture a Roman citizen like this?" And when Paul says he's a Roman citizen, that gets the attention of the Roman soldiers. And they end up saving Paul from the mob and sending him here to Caesarea, where Paul appears before the Roman governor of the time, a man whose name is Felix. And Felix keeps Paul in custody without making any formal charges for 2 years. Luke says Felix was hoping for a bribe from Paul. And so Paul ends up living right here in Caesarea almost longer than he lives anyplace else in the book of Acts. He lives here for at least 2 years because he's stuck here in prison. In fact, he is still here in 59 AD when Felix's term as Roman governor ends and Festus, the new Roman governor, comes in. And Festus decides he's going to figuratively clear his desk of all the paperwork that Felix has left over. And so he hears about Paul's case and decides, we're going to get this taken care of. He invites Paul to go to Jerusalem. He invites Jerusalem to come down and make its case against Paul, the Jerusalem leadership. And what ends up is that Paul says, there's no way I'm going back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem lawyers come down here to Caesarea, and another trial takes place here in Caesarea. And during the trial before Festus and King Herod Agrippa, Paul shares the story of his conversion and talks about seeing the resurrected Jesus in a vision. And then in Acts 26:24, at this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You are out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane." "I am not insane, most excellent Festus," Paul replied. "What I'm saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it wasn't done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do." And now every head swivels toward the king because they're wondering, what is King Agrippa going to say? And he kind of is calculating, if I say, yes, of course I believe in the prophets, then Paul's going to say, then why don't you believe in the Messiah of whom they prophesied? But if I say, no, I don't believe in those prophets, well, then everybody's going to want me out as their king. And so Agrippa comes up with a very astute answer. He says, Paul, do you really expect to convert me in such a short time? And so he kind of escapes kind of the point of the question. And Paul's answer is very wry, kind of very humorous. He says, King Agrippa, I wish that you could be exactly as I am, except of course for these chains. King Agrippa and Festus consult, and they decide Paul has done nothing worthy of punishment, but because Paul has appealed to Caesar, and frankly just to get him out of their hair, they decide to put him on a ship with some other prisoners bound for Rome. And Paul begins his final great adventure across the Mediterranean Sea, one that would lead through storms and shipwrecks and snake bites, eventually to the capital of the empire, to Rome itself. To me, this story is amazing because it shows God working even in a case where there's the most unjust, aggravating, hard circumstances. I mean, you've got assassins, you've got slanderers, you've got scheming, lying lawyers, you've got conspirators, you've got government bureaucrats, and eventually you'll have shipwrecks. There's all kinds of evil people and bad circumstances seemingly conspiring against Paul. And yet through it all, he never loses his cool. He keeps his wits about him. He keeps consistently testifying to the gospel of grace and what God has done in his life. And eventually, now it takes years for this to work out, but eventually Paul gets, you could say, an all expenses paid trip to Rome, expenses paid by the Roman government, and he ends up under house arrest in Rome, as we will later see in the book of Acts. But this means that the gospel travels to the very household of Caesar himself. And so I love this because it shows you how God takes really bad circumstances and really bad people, really bad court system, people who really did not have Paul's best interests in mind at all, and yet God is working behind the scenes, Romans 8:28 style, to make sure all things work out together for good in the end, years later. And that tells you and it tells me to hang on even when circumstances look extremely tough, very dire, unfair, unjust. God is still working behind the scenes in your life and in mine.